Today started out as an absolutely gorgeous clear blue sky, 70 degrees here in North Dallas, and several days this week started out this way, but it seems like every day sometime between 2 o'clock and 3 o'clock this starts to happen. I don't know if you guys can see it in the distance there. Nice chemtrail streaks going on right there and over there, and all these clouds are very recent. They just showed up within the last half hour or so. These started out as streaks across the sky and then became these wispy clouds, and I can almost guarantee you that within an hour or two from now the sky is going to be completely overcast with artificial poisonous chemtrail clouds. This should piss you off. It certainly pisses me off. And here it is about an hour and a half later. These freaking bastards are still spraying. Look at this sky. It's not even blue anymore. It's all gray and hazy. But all of that crap over there, none of that was there 3 hours ago. This is ridiculous. All jacked up, why your sinuses are all messed up, why you can't stop coughing, why it seems like everyone you know is sick with some kind of respiratory problem. Well, that's the problem right there. That's it. It's not some just random seasonal flu. It's chemtrail flu. This is the problem right here, folks. If you're sick of it, start spreading the word. This has to stop. Bastards. That's a normal plane right there. Just flying along, no contrails, no chemtrails. And if you still don't know the difference between a contrail and a chemtrail, you know, pull your head out of whatever dark orifice it may be stuck in, because there is a massive difference between a contrail and a chemtrail. Contrail trails behind the plane, it's just condensation. It's like 2 or 3 feet long from our perspective looking up. It does not leave streaks from one end of the horizon to the other. Streaks like that over there. See that streak? That's going to be turning into a toxic cloud very soon. Contrails don't do this. Chemtrails do. This was a clear blue sky 3 hours ago. And this should piss you off. This is bullshit. And I'm sorry. You know, maybe I shouldn't use bad language like that. And if you're more concerned that I said bullshit than you are about the fact that you're breathing toxic chemicals that somebody in our government has authorized to be sprayed on us, then you got to reevaluate your priorities. This is a big problem. You know, we all have to actually breathe, people. And we can't breathe when our air is being polluted. People want to talk about pollution and having your car inspected, you know, to make sure you have the right, you know, emissions. Well, look at this. And this is every day. The last few days would have been amazingly gorgeous, clear blue skies, awesome days, if it weren't for these Luciferian bastards trying to kill us by filling our skies with toxic chemical clouds. And this has been happening like every freaking day. So let's spread the word, get the word out. When 300 million of us finally wake up and realize that somebody in our government is authorizing this stuff, then maybe with, you know, that kind of numbers, we could actually do something. Right now, just me ranting and raving in a field's not going to do anything. You ranting and raving in a field's not going to do anything. 300 million of us waking up and realizing that somebody's trying to kill us, somebody's poisoning us, somebody's intentionally putting toxic chemicals into our sky, well, then maybe we should be able to do something about it. In the meantime, start looking up, start paying attention, because somebody's trying to kill us. Welcome
Welcome to the Revolutionary Radio Project. I'm your host, Rob Skiba. Those of you who have been following my work for the past 10 years or so, you know that I frequently talk about conspiracies of various sorts, and one of the worst of them, in my opinion, is that of chemtrails. And I've certainly talked about that on more than a few occasions. In fact, as many of you already know, few things tick me off more than going out on a beautiful, nice, sunny day, looking up and seeing a bunch of chemtrail planes spraying the crap out of our skies with toxic metals and God knows what else. Well, when it comes to this particular issue, pun intended, I believe you would be hard-pressed to find anyone more knowledgeable than my guest this evening. His name is Dane Wigington. Dane's background is in the solar energy industry. He is a former employee of Bechtel Power Corp and was a licensed contractor in the states of California and Arizona. He's been engaged in constant climate geoengineering research for the past 15 years. He owns a wildlife preserve next to Lake Shasta in Northern California. In fact, his personal residence was even featured in a cover article on the world's largest renewable energy magazine, Home Power. Dane put all of his focus, efforts, and energy researching the climate engineering issue when he began to lose very significant amounts of solar uptake due to the ever-increasing solar obscuration issue caused from jet aircraft spraying the skies above his mountaintop home. He also noticed a significant decline in forest health, and it appeared to be accelerating. So he soon began extensive testing and research into the issue of geoengineering and has continued doing so since 2002. He's the lead researcher for the website geoengineeringwatch.org and has investigated all levels of geoengineering from stratospheric aerosol geoengineering to solar radiation management and the various activities of facilities like HARP. Dane has appeared on numerous films and radio interviews in an effort to educate the public on the extremely dire environmental and health dangers we face from these ongoing global climate intervention programs. And so it is my great honor to welcome him here for the first time to the Revolutionary Radio Project. Dane, are you there, sir?
I hear you loud and clear, Rob. Is my audio okay?
Yes, you sound great. Thanks so much for coming on.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for your courage in addressing this issue that, as we discussed off air, very few people yet understand the gravity and immediacy of what is unfolding. And I certainly don't blame everything on the climate engineering operations, though, as we also discussed, mathematically speaking, it is the single greatest climate disrupting factor at this moment. And that is not to negate all the other forms of human damage to the planet, not in any way denying that. But I'm stating the intentional climate intervention operations are not only derailing all of Earth's life support systems, and we are currently in what is scientifically termed an abrupt climate collapse at this moment. That will become ever more clear as the weeks and months go by. But these programs also, Rob, and I'll give the mic back to you, they are contaminating literally every breath we take. We have the lab tests to prove that. We just completed the first time ever atmospheric testing from a flying lab. And I can go into more details when you choose.
Absolutely. You're talking about every breath we take. And one of the reasons why I've mentioned it so much on my radio broadcast is for whatever reason, probably because I had asthma as a kid, it really affects my respiratory system. And the worst I've ever experienced was, I think it was the beginning of last year, 2018. I was out location scouting for the TV series I'm working on, and I was in the desert of Arizona in the Tucson to Tombstone region, that area down there. And I was alone in the desert, so I wasn't around people. It wasn't like I caught the flu from somebody. I was out in the desert for like 5 days, and they were spraying the sky like crazy. And I got so sick, man. Like, I thought I was going to die. I was sick and I don't get sick. I'm thankfully a very healthy person, but I couldn't breathe and was coughing and hacking my lungs out for 2 months straight. And that's when I'm like, okay, yeah, I've been passionate about this for a long time, but I got really passionate about it after that because they're freaking killing us. And like, something has to be done about this. And I've followed you on Facebook. I see a lot of the stuff you're posting. And so I finally, I got to reach out to this guy, and you graciously responded very quickly. So I'm excited to have you on tonight to dive into this issue. Before we do, though, I read a little bit about your bio there, but tell us a little bit more about yourself, your background, and what got you interested in going into this as deep as you have?
Well, honestly, Rob, this is the last thing I wanted to do with the last 15 plus years of my life. Not an activist, not politically oriented. But I knew when I was losing substantial amounts of my solar power uptake, as you mentioned, that this could not be condensation. I was apprehensive of my first lab test at the state certified lab of precipitation. If it's in the rain, it's in the air column. I did not want to find climate engineering elements starting with aluminum because I knew if I did, it would alter the course of my life, which is what happened. When the first test came back positive for aluminum at 7 parts per billion, which was high. I talked to a hydrogeologist immediately with that test. It was high for my filtered forested location. I'm on the West Coast. The air comes off the Pacific. Subsequent tests over the next 18 months saw single rain events with aluminum as high as 3,450 parts per billion. That's an increase of almost 50%, or excuse me, 50,000%. That's highly toxic rain, extraordinarily toxic rain that kills soil microbes, affects root systems. Trees are dying from below ground just as they are above ground. You mentioned your respiratory issues, and this is where we really cut to the heart of the matter, because many people have unfortunately lost sight of the fact that as the environment dies, we will die with it. But even closer to home is the fact that every breath we take is laden with these particles, and we're not guessing. And we have just completed, we work with several highly credentialed scientists. We have a legal team, and we have just completed for the first test of their type it's an aerosol testing flying lab. And we have captured climate engineering contaminants by flying through a layer of haze that is a dispersion from heavy aircraft at altitude. We have definitely connected the biggest dot in this issue. There will be more information coming on this. There's only so much I can disclose now. We're working on a documentary film we hope to have out in about 3 months or less. There'll be a great deal of information disclosed there. We have Air Force generals. We have already interviewed 2 of them that are speaking to us. They're both retired because they couldn't speak out otherwise, but we'll bring this data forward. But the bottom line is this, Rob, the skyrocketing, you mentioned your respiratory issues across the board are going off the scale. Every human disease and ailment that we know is connected with these specific contaminants, starting with aluminum, is going through the roof. Alzheimer's, dementia, #1 cause of death, #1 in UK. And these particles are highly inflammatory. What do we see on commercials, Rob? Every other commercial is COPD, asthma, allergy, right? So anyway, I'll give it back to you. But the bottom line is this is a very real fight for life, and we can't breathe in without sucking this material in.
Yeah, so, I mean, like, who in the right mind, I mean, I call them Luciferian bastards because I don't know how else to describe these people. Who in their right mind would do this to us? Like, I mean, aren't they being affected too, and their own families, their own kids? Are they that stupid, or is this, I mean, what's your take on that?
That's a very important question that everyone asks, and it's a question or premise that many use to ignore the issue and walk away because they say, quote, they. And who are they? We're talking about the top of the food chain here, the central bankers, those who print money, who fund militaries, and who thus own countries. But if we look at their perspective, those who are doing this to themselves, and why would they do this to themselves? Let's go backward first to how many other things have those at the top done to themselves, starting with the nuclear detonations. Over 2,000 nuclear detonations. And some of those detonations, for those that don't know, some of those single detonations were bombs that were 1,000 times more powerful than the Hiroshima and Nagasaki detonations. And they detonated 2,000 of them. And even the bombs detonated on U.S. soil, about 650 of them, studies now prove were responsible for 450,000 American deaths or more as a consequence of the fallout. You don't see that on mainstream TV. So every living thing on the planet was contaminated from these detonations. Now let's look at Fukushima, a potential existential threat by itself if other factors don't do the job first, which I would argue is going to be the case on the current course. But triple nuclear meltdown in Fukushima, No end in sight, no technology known to fix it, and we're building 60 more nuke plants now. So what we're dealing with at the top, to finish off your question, we're dealing with individuals at the top who are literally clinically not sane. And if we look at psychoanalysis of these individuals, there's a common thread in their various forms of psychosis, and that common thread is this: a near total lack of comprehension as to the consequences of their actions, even to themselves. They behave as a cancer behaves. Does a cancer intend to kill the host? No, it intends to expand at any cost. The host eventually dies. That's what we're dealing with.
So, this is the top.
You're breaking up really bad. I can only hear every other word.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. So, as I said at the beginning of this broadcast, I've talked about a lot of conspiracies. Are you familiar with the Georgia Guidestones?
Yes, sir.
So the first one says, the first commandment on the Georgia Guidestones says, keep and maintain the world population at 500 million. Do you think this is part of a depopulation agenda?
I don't think we can argue that fact, but there are bigger wheels in play. And there are many layers to this scenario, and that's very important to remember. It's not a simple scenario. There are many agendas being carried out in our skies. So if I can, I'm not in any way disputing that eugenics is a part of this equation. But if we look at the damage done to the planet, this planet is an unbelievably miraculous ecosystem that we have treated with unimaginable contempt. And that's simply the fact of the matter. And I'm not an Al Gore fan. Carbon credits are certainly simply disaster capitalism. I'm not a fan of that either. But what I'm saying is this: human activity has derailed the planet, climate engineering being the single biggest factor, but there are many, many other factors. And when climate engineering was first deployed, and this will answer the why question, it appeared it was deployed at scale immediately after World War II. The planet was heating very rapidly. It worked in the eyes of the global power structure, which includes other nations. And it had a temporary cooling effect from about the mid-40s to the mid-70s, but the negative aspects had not kicked in, like the destruction of the ozone layer, the killing of the boreal forests, and the destroyed ozone layer releases some UV, which kills plankton. All of those factors we need for Earth to make natural clouds. Forests, plankton are all cloud producers. So in the attempt to keep power, in the attempt to use weather as a weapon, and by the way, that's another major factor of this issue. Weather is being used for a weapon all over the globe. It's used to bring countries to their knees, cutting off their precipitation, creating other forms of weather cataclysm, toppling countries without those countries ever knowing they went to war. But in the use of this as a weapon, immense damage has been done. And I'll finish with this. With climate engineering, the damage that's done now is beyond comprehension. I mean, we are literally free falling into what is scientifically termed an abrupt climate collapse. On the current course, no one gets out alive, and I mean on the very near term horizon if we can't change course. But now much of the climate engineering operations, this is the core of what I'm going to say, are designed to mask the severity of what's unfolding from the population to keep business as usual until the last possible moment. And the single biggest example of that is the U.S. lower 48, where, as I told you off air, in the previous 5 years, the most consistently less warm location on the entire planet is the U.S. lower 48. And that's only 1/200th of the Earth's surface area. So for those that live in the lower 48 that have been in a cool down zone, an engineered chemically ice-nucleated cool down zone, who think that it's cool here, so therefore it must be cool everywhere, so therefore anyone who says it's warming on the planet is not accurate, I ask you to consider you're living on 0.5% of Earth's surface area. That's not a reflection of the whole planet. Planet's in total, absolute meltdown. Climate engineering is further fueling that fire.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Aren't they causing? I mean, causing the very thing that they're claiming to stop?
This is key. That's a very key question also. The short answer is yes, but there's a caveat. Climate engineering can and does create short-term, highly toxic cool downs at the cost of an even worse warming. So, Rob, you remember in 2014, 2015, all the headlines about the record Boston snow? Remember that?
Yeah.
And everybody thought, how could it be warming? Look at all this snow. And they didn't tell you on those headlines that we had no snow 14,000 feet up in the Sierras. So the media who serves the power structure fixates on these target zones where they create substantial winter weather events with chemical ice nucleation. This is a patented process of, we have these patents, by the way, they go back over 50 years. They can seed clouds with endothermic chemicals. These are energy absorbing chemicals that can literally turn what should have been a liquid precipitation event, a rain event, into a snow event. They can literally engineer snowstorms. The snow behaves very differently than naturally nucleated snow, but they can do it. So you might remember Boston, as we said, you remember all the headlines about Erie, Pennsylvania, the record snow that just happened there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And these headlines are trumpeted from every mainstream media source to confuse and divide the U.S. population as to the true state of climate implosion. At the same time, for example, in March of this year, we had temperatures in India and Pakistan pushing 115 degrees in March. In Australia right now, as we speak, record high temperatures. They're almost into their winter season, and it's still 80s and 90s in places. Again, the severity of what's unfolding cannot be overstated. So to go back to the why of geoengineering, it's weather as a weapon that they're using in countries all over the globe, and now including against the U.S. population, because if the U.S. population were to wake up and find out what's been done to them without their knowledge or consent, I would argue they will be taken to the streets with their proverbial pitchforks and torches. And those in power know that. So weather's been used as a weapon, and the seeding of the sky with these electrically conductive particulates is used for over-the-horizon radar. The ionizing of the atmosphere is used for various forms of communication, EMP, electromagnetic pulse, offense and defense. It's a giant physics lab for those in power, and they have no regard for the consequences. And 5G is also intertwined with climate engineering.
Yeah. And you mentioned something that's real important. Without our consent, without our knowledge or consent.
Correct.
You know, I look up in the sky and I'm like, I didn't consent to this. I didn't agree to this. I didn't vote for this. I didn't, you know, we have no say in it. And how do I even know what they're spraying? How do any of us know? I mean, we understand that a lot of the tests come back with aluminum, barium, strontium, and whatnot. But, you know, most people aren't even aware of that. What's to stop them from putting literally anything they want in the spray?
Really key question. That's a very important question you just asked, and that's one that I hope your listeners contemplate. The short answer is there's nothing to stop them. And why would we think they wouldn't do that when they feel they're losing control of the situation? I would argue that is absolutely a card they intend to play. We're all getting sick very rapidly as it is. Your listeners should understand these particulates. We're talking about nanoparticulates. They're unimaginably small. You can fit 60,000 across the width of a human hair. We've already identified from the atmospheric testing I just went over, and this testing just occurred about a month ago, we've already identified particles as small as 10 nanometers. The smaller the particle, the more readily it is absorbed into the system. When you inhale, it goes into your olfactory nerve, enters the bloodstream, crosses the blood-brain barrier. These particles are very bioaccumulative, means they build up in your system. They're bioavailable and bioaccumulative, so your body absorbs them very readily and then it holds on to them. And the human body, as resilient as it is, once it reaches its breaking point, that breakdown occurs very quickly, and that is starting to occur in society. One more factor to consider. Rob, you know aluminum obviously is very harmful, yes?
Yeah, oh yeah.
And mercury, you know that. Mercury is also very harmful. We have peer-reviewed science study that reveals when these two metals, for example, are combined, as they are being combined in our bodies now, something called synergistic toxicity occurs. The overall toxicity goes up as much as 100 times. It's 10,000% worse. And you correctly stated, Rob, we don't know what they're spraying on us. We don't. We've identified many of the major constituents, but we're still working on the full panel of what's in our samples. And as you correctly stated, at any time of their choosing, the spray operations are already in place. They can put a pathogen, for example, in the mix, game over.
Yeah, I mean, do you think it's obviously it's got to all be tied together because they're making this forced vaccinations and everything. And of course, there's all the issues with the mercury and whatnot that's in vaccinations. So it's like they're pumping us full of mercury on the ground, and they're spraying us full of aluminum in the sky to form the synergistic toxicity.
I would agree. I would absolutely agree. And again, we're back. This is important for listeners to understand as well, that this is a complex scenario, and we're back to the Georgia Guidestones, as you mentioned, the stated goal of 500 million, and the actual amount of human population based on current technology that the planet can actually, quote, sustain, again, given current technology, is in that range. And Rob, you probably hear people refer to the fact that, well, no, they deny that fact. And I've heard many people refer to the state of Texas. They say, well, no, everybody could fit in the state of Texas and have their own house and still have some room left over. But the point with the planet's ability to sustain human population, it's not elbow room, it's resources. And we have decimated the planet's resources that have been built up for tens of millions of years. We have gone through that in the geologic blink of an eye. And that's what's important to remember. And you can't just put that back. If we consider paleo events, those are events in Earth's past that are comparable to what's happening now, except what's happening now is exponentially worse. 55 million years ago, you had an event called the Pedum event, Paleocene, Eocene, thermal maximum, methane mass extinction. And we can talk about methane later because it's happening now. And I'm not referring to necessarily to livestock. It's much bigger methane deposits that are thawing and releasing into the atmosphere. But during this event, which was global mass extinction, and we're in the sixth great mass extinction now, but the equilibrium period after this event was about 10 to 20 million years. So what I'm saying is, back to the population situation and how much can the Earth support, it's to recover from this type of event that we're going through right now. And this is called the Anthropocene that we're in now, the age of man. That's a scientific term, the Anthropocene. It was not sustainable, never even close. And those in power are doing everything they can to mask that from the public for as long as possible. And I'm not the blame should rest most completely on those at the top who have set up this paradigm. But unfortunately, we've had a population so far, the majority of which was very happy with this paradigm and didn't really want to look at this type of data. But I hope that changes, because, Rob, the only way we can have any chance of salvaging anything from this equation is if a significant percentage of the population wakes up, realizes the severity of what's unfolding, and helps us to, our first leap forward would be to expose and halt climate engineering and allow the planet to respond to the damage that's been done.
Yeah. I mean, to me, it's like if their goal is to, quote unquote, save the planet from the devastation of, alleged climate.
I didn't mean to imply that. Only to hide the damage.
This is what they're trying to do.
Hide the damage, not to try to, they're not actually trying to do anything benevolent. I didn't mean to imply that if I did.
Not you, no. But that's what we hear from the mainstream media.
Yes.
Tell us that we need this, right? This is necessary to save the planet from, future climate change devastation. But, if their goal is to save the Earth from this pending doom, how does it make sense to try to stop that by poisoning all living creatures? We still end up with everybody dead.
You're exactly right. And this is the question that everyone needs to ask themselves. And I never ask anybody to believe anything I'm stating. In fact, I ask them not to. I ask them simply to investigate what I'm stating. So your point is very simple and straightforward and extremely accurate. And thus we end up with the unavoidable conclusion that there is no benevolence in this. There's nothing at all in the way of mitigation for what's happening. In fact, it is further driving the final nails into our collective coffins. We now know, after 70 years of global climate engineering, that it is an unimaginable cataclysm. And for academia and official agencies to pretend that what we see in the sky isn't actually going on. And think how absurd that is, Rob. Everything we see in the sky, these obscuring trails that spread out and cover the whole horizon, blot out the sun, the materials that are raining down through the air column, the destruction of the ozone layer, the derailing of the hydrological cycle, every single dot is exactly what the climate science community says will happen if we climate engineer. But, then they try to convince us that even though we're seeing all that now, that's not really what this is, and we're not really doing it yet.
Yeah, that's what drives me crazy is I'm seeing all these articles coming out now in mainstream from like 2017 to recently saying this is all on the drawing board for, this is what we think we could spray the sky, and this may help. It's like, no, this has been going on for decades.
Exactly.
Well, we're going to break right now. So when we come back from the break, we'll talk more about that. The Revolutionary Radio Project. I'm your host, Rob Skiba, and I'm talking with my guest this evening, Dane Wigington. We're talking about chemtrails, geoengineering, and all that good stuff. Right before the break, I was mentioning that it seems like in the last couple of years, I've been seeing a lot of articles in mainstream news coming out saying, "Oh yeah, this is all on the drawing board." That maybe if we could send airplanes up and spray the skies with reflective metals that can reflect the sunlight back, and that'll help stop global warming, as if they haven't been doing it for decades. I mean, that's got to drive you crazy.
Well, certainly it does. And I deal with a lot in academia. There are many in academia, and they're often the hardest to reach of all. Well, one, because their paychecks and pensions depend on them not acknowledging this issue. But two, because many in academia have been so successfully programmed, and I've had double PhDs state this to my face, that, quote, it's not real, referring to climate engineering, it's not happening unless or until a peer-reviewed study says it is. So think of the absurdity of that. They're telling me literally in their world, in their frame of reality, unless the very institutions that the power structure controls admit to this crime, then it's not happening. So that's the Orwellian world we live in. And I wanted to, before I forget to, Rob, mention that it's very important, if your listeners are trying to convey this issue to others, to stick to the science terms. Try to avoid the chemtrails term like the plague. Unless you're speaking in a private conversation, certainly it's fine, it's a descriptive term. But that term, if people go to search it online, leads always to conspiracy theory and hoax by design. And it's not a science term, there's no basis for the term. So to gain traction in the battle, if you're trying to introduce the subject to others, it's best to stick to the science term. Climate engineering, the most simple, but you also have geoengineering or solar radiation management, cloud albedo enhancement. There's other terms, but the climate engineering term is certainly the most recognizable.
What about persistent contrails? You hear that all the time.
You do, and I've never, the originator of that term, or the one who I think propagated it the most, was a friend. She was a USDA scientist that I knew fairly well, and my argument with her was this: that it's not a contrail, and if people think it's a contrail, whether it's short or long, they don't really care because they're convinced it's just condensation, and it is not. We're talking about a particulate dispersion, so it's important to make that clear. You could call it a particulate trail. That's in fact what it is. And again, on this subject, Rob, it's important to maybe clarify that all commercial all commercial carriers and all military tankers are fitted with what's called a high bypass turbofan jet engine. It's a jet-powered fan. About 90% of the air that goes through that engine is non-combusted. So that engine by design is nearly incapable of producing any condensation trail except under rare and extreme circumstances. Atmospheric temperatures are going up, making condensation trails, if they were occurring, even less likely. Atmospheric relative humidity, because of climate engineering, is actually dropping in many regions, which makes, again, condensation trails, if that's what they were, even less likely. So the bottom line is we're not seeing condensation with very rare exceptions. And we have film footage, so your listeners know, of these aircraft taken at altitude up close with nozzles visible, turning on and off. That's the end of the argument. It's not condensation.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that argument, helicopter in the Army for 6 to 8 years that I was in, and you spend a lot of time in aviation, and I'm like, look, I mean, standard contrails, they follow the plane, from our perspective, about a foot behind the plane, and they follow it all the way across the sky. They don't leave a long trail that goes one end of the horizon to the other and stays up in the sky all day long. Like, that's just ridiculous that people even still think that. And my wife and I have been fighting this battle forever, trying to get people to understand. It's like the movie They Live, when Roddy Piper just put the glasses on. People, she hated the movie, right? There's like a 10-minute fist fight. And she's like, this is stupid. This is ridiculous. I said, yeah, but look at what all he wants his friend to do is put on the freaking glasses.
I remember.
Yeah. So, God bless my wife. She got dressed up in a bikini, printed up a whole bunch of flyers on chemtrails or condensate, whatever you want to call them, persistent particulate, whatever, and went out to the pool wearing a gas mask at our apartment complex. So people are at the pool and they look over at her like, what's this woman doing with this gas mask? And all she did was point up to the sky and hand them a flyer. It's like, well, whatever you got to do to get people to wake up, because it's like nobody pays any attention to it. We had our roof redone because we had hail damage, and the roofers were here, and they were spraying the sky. It was this one big crisscross grid in the sky. And, of course, I start talking about it. He's like, I never noticed that. I'm like, how could you not notice that? It's there every day. But it wasn't like that when I was a kid. I don't remember skies like that. You talk about it going back to World War II, and I want to ask you about this. I know that there were weather experimentations and things like that happening since World War II, but it seems to me that the active spraying of our skies and crisscross grids I don't remember it happening prior to about 1997. Would that be about right?
You're very close. It would have 98 is when we saw a big ramp up. And let me back up. First, I didn't know that you're in the military. How long, Rob?
I was in 8 years.
That's a long time. Certainly my deepest respect to you for speaking out now. And that's who we most need to reach is our military brothers and sisters, so that they know what they're involved with. And some of the planes going back many decades, and some of the military aircraft, you had low bypass turbofan engines or turbojet engines, and you had engines that produced a more consistent contrail like you described. What we see now behind some of the aircraft that do seem to leave a shorter, persistent but very bright trail, some of the commercial carriers that are being mistaken for a condensation trail, there are also fuel additives in this equation. So that leaves a much more consistent trail. It's not a payload dispersion that's being turned on and off, but there is that aspect of climate engineering, fuel additives that are also being used to help saturate the sky with atmospheric particulates. Kudos to your wife for taking that kind of an effort. Please give her my deepest regard for going to that effort. And that's unfortunately what needs to be done sometimes, because so many in the population at this point are so fixated on iPhones and other forms of distractions that the sky could be on fire and they wouldn't notice. Yeah. Back to the World War II aircraft, many refer to the B-17s that, they left condensation trails, therefore this must all be condensation. First, the B-17 bombers and some of the other piston engine bombers had very, very crude piston-driven engines that put out a tremendous amount of particulate matter. 2, B-17s had water vapor injection systems on them. And 3, we have recovered film footage, World War II film footage of a B-17 turning its, quote, condensation trail off during flight and formation. We have very up close. We did a full post on this footage that we found. That is not condensation. And we know beta testing was absolutely going on at the end of World War II because they fully deployed after World War II. So the notion that the B-17 bombers and the massive condensation trail, we have images of them, Rob, where in the same approximate altitude and formation, some are leaving a trail from horizon to horizon, and some are leaving none. So positively, that's not just an issue of condensation. And again, we have patents for climate engineering and weather modification going back to 1920. We have film footage of these being tested, biplanes putting out massive trails we have the patents and the diagrams for the spray mechanisms in the aircraft. So again, people need to just simply look at the data. They need to look at the historical documentation. And Rob, have you ever seen, it's on the front 30 seconds of my weekly East and West Coast broadcast called Global Alert News. It's AM, FM, East and West Coast. Have you ever seen the short clip of President Johnson raving like a maniac, talking about he who controls the weather controls the world? Have you seen that?
Yeah. And that was also, I don't know if it was part of the same speech, but he was talking about the massive military industrial complex. Like, we need to watch out because this is a big problem.
That was Eisenhower. That was Eisenhower. But Johnson, who is a very unscrupulous individual that we now know, and I would encourage your listeners to search that President Johnson climate engineering. They can find that clip online, or they can go to geoengineeringwatch.org and open any Global Alert News and click it. First 30 seconds, it's there. So what Johnson said in 1962 was this. He acknowledged that we had the power to control the world's cloud cover then, and that he who controls the weather controls the world. I have original copies in my possession of Popular Science from 1958 and Collier's Magazine from 1953, both of which major articles on the climate engineering operations and their ability to alter, at least temporarily and toxically, the planet's thermostat and to be used as a weapon, weather as a weapon. So we've had this technology for a very long time, but as power structure realized the population was not going to respond very favorably to this, and the consequences were cataclysmic, they began to take a position that this was all just proposal. They began to not allow publications like Pop Science and Collier's to address this issue. They began to go underground.
So you were talking about this ramping up in the late 90s, 1998. You said one of the things that I'm a filmmaker now, and I watch a lot of the shows that I grew up with. You know, sometimes I get nostalgic. I want to go back and watch old shows. You don't see crisscross skies in any of the shows that we grew up with, you know, in the 70s and 80s. You start moving into the 2000s, and it's actually becoming rather problematic for filmmakers, especially if they're trying to make a historical piece, you know, some kind of ancient epic or something. The sky has to be painted out now because it's always got chemtrails being sprayed, and you don't see that in the old TV shows, but nowadays it's in everything.
You don't see it very often in the older programs, although you do see it sometimes because it was still going on. I believe in 1975, or it might even have been in 1965, Clint Eastwood Western, I just saw a big blatant trail in the background. And they're there in some, and it's possible that, you know, there might be some additions in some major films to try to, you know, further condition the population. We know that that's happening with animated children's films. It's very insidious, very twisted, that in the background of children's animated films like Cars, Over the Hedge, they put these trails everywhere in the background. That helps to condition children to believe this is, quote, normal or natural when it's anything but. And in regard to the ramp up in 1998, to that point, that was the warmest year ever recorded. A lot of alarm bells went off. So what did the climate engineering industrial complex do? They simply doubled down. That's what they do best. When something in their frame of thinking, because again, this is a tool for them, it's a weapon. Many corporations, Boeing, Lockheed Martin, and many others, making untold fortunes off these operations. So if something appears to be doing harm, and in that case, you know, the planet obviously continuing to warm in spite of their operations, and as you correctly stated, Rob, in many ways because of their operations, because even though they can block some of the daytime incoming thermal radiation with these particulates, it traps heat at night, destroys the ozone layer, as I stated, disrupts the hydrological cycle. I could go on, but the bottom line is in their frame of thinking, they're just not doing enough. They want to do more. It's more profitable to do more. And that's exactly what they did. And 1998 was a big ramp-up year.
I never thought of that, heat at night. Because one of the things that I was saying, because last year when I got so sick, after that, I became more of an activist about this and started talking about it more and started documenting. In fact, I started noticing a pattern here where I live in the North Dallas, Texas area. We will have beautiful, clear sky, 70 degrees, beautiful day until about 2 to 3 p.m. And that's when they start spraying. And they'll go from 2 to roughly between 5 and 7, sometimes as late as 8 and 9. But by 5 o'clock to 6 o'clock at night and in the evening, the sky will be a nasty, milky, ugly, gray, slimy looking, just horrible. What started out as an amazing day ends up just nasty. And I started thinking to myself, if their goal is to supposedly reflect sunlight, why are they spraying at 9 o'clock, at 8 o'clock at night when the sun's going down? But I didn't think of that it's trapping the heat. That's what
it is. And in answer to your question as to why those late hour aerosol dispersions, I had some communication with an insider from Oak Ridge Lab. I published 2 of those conversations, and the stated purpose of some of those early evening dispersions, warm air rises in the evening. That's why it cools down on the surface. And the climate engineers feel that by dispersing over some of these areas where there's convection occurring, that will help keep the particles aloft longer, perhaps into the next day. That doesn't appear to be the case because the particle descent times are quite rapid. A polymer chemist we work with estimated descent times of 12 to 24 hours. That's a very rapid descent. And these are metal particulates. Gravity takes hold. And the recent atmospheric testing we did confirmed descent times in a similar range. So these particles descend fast enough that they have to constantly keep applying them. Now, as they're coming down to the Earth's surface, I would encourage your listeners to, on a dark, still night, after heavy aerosol operations, when the air is as you just described, go outside away from other lights, so it's dark, with a very powerful headlight, aim it at the sky, and they will be absolutely shocked at how much material is raining down through the air column.
Wow.
At night, with that situation, it's very reflective. It will look like it's snowing in that beam, literally.
Oh, man.
It's that bad. And we're inhaling all of that. So, again, the lethality of this can't be overstated. And to put this in perspective, how fast is the planet heating mathematically? And it's important to understand that once you trigger what's called a feedback loop, and there appears to be as many as 50 in play right now. And let me just make mention of the single largest one. Rob, in the Bermuda Triangle, ships have been sinking for many decades, right?
Yeah.
In the military. So we now know that that's from formerly frozen methane hydrate deposits on the seabed that are thawing because the oceans are warming. And when those fields release, they tend to release very quickly in their entirety. That aerates the water like a bottle of champagne or Coke. Ships have no buoyancy. They go to the ground intact. Same with the prop-driven aircraft that have gone down. Counterintuitively, that methane actually will kill, as it rises through the air column, it will kill a prop engine airplane as well. So we've had these methane fields releasing. Methane is lighter than air. It rises into the atmosphere, starts to cover the planet like a layer of glass, trapping even more heat, in addition to climate engineering trapping heat, which releases more methane, which traps even more heat, and so on. You follow me on the feedback loop. So the mathematical rate of warming right now statistically is equivalent to the thermal energy, the heat contained in 4 Hiroshima bombs per second, 4 to 5 per second. That's 400,000 per day. I realize that's very difficult to believe, but that's how fast the planet is warming. I would encourage your listeners to search exactly what I stated, and they will find the science study with that exact comparison. And it's important to understand that heat has gone into the ocean, the vast majority, and the ice deposits. But when those are gone, and they're about gone in the Arctic, we may have an ice-free summer this year, then the heating goes unimaginably exponential. And we are at that point. That's why I expressed the immediacy of what we face. It's not centuries out. It's not decades out. I will be surprised, and maybe I will be, but I will be surprised if we reach the end of this year without major disruptions in our reality. And this is important to understand as well. It's not just waking up and finding overnight the planet stops supporting life, but what it is as the power structure realizes, and we are almost at that point, that they can't hide the severity of what's unfolding from the population, they will play very big cards, major false flag events, a instigation of global conflict. That's what military machines do, unfortunately. And I know, knowing there's people like you in the military is encouraging. I know there are many, but I hope they're able to get past their compartmentalization, understand what they're a part of, understand that whatever they're being told, and they're certainly being told these are benevolent programs. Rob, as you know, the pilots spraying Agent Orange on their comrades on the ground weren't told this is going to kill your comrade, right?
Well, yeah, that's the thing that's frustrating to me and it seems like, one hand, and maybe you can help me out with this, but this is a strategy that I've been thinking about for a long time is, well, first of all, where are these planes flying out of? Like, what's their launch point? Do you know?
We're aware of many, and there are certainly many more. And regard to the commercial carriers, because commercial carriers are being used. There's no question about that. We can film them from the ground. We can film them from airborne platforms, which we've done. We have up-close photographs of the nozzles mounted on commercial aircraft. You can see all this at geoengineeringwatch.org, by the way. Nozzles mounted on the pylon, aimed into the exhaust jet stream to make this look like condensation. You don't put nozzles aimed into an exhaust jet stream unless you're going to spray something. So on the commercial carriers, we do not believe, have no reason to believe from the available data, that commercial personnel are not directly involved. But their aircraft are being used. These systems are automated, controlled remotely. Commercial carriers, of course, carry a much smaller payload. Rob, do you remember when suddenly there was a big issue with how much luggage you have on an aircraft?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I travel all the time. I'm always flying.
And that occurred about the time of some of the ramp ups.
But somebody must know there's got to be equipment installed on these commercial aircraft that, like my wife's stepdad works at an airline. And I think he works in the luggage area. I mean, there has to be equipment on there that reduce the luggage space that they have to be aware of, right? I mean,
they do. There is. There's been one letter that was particularly damning from a union airline mechanic that wanted to know why they were not allowed to work on these systems. He persisted until he was fired. Those letters still exist. And on the loading of these aerosols, again, much smaller payload, but it appears that possibly, we have some film footage of this, that some of the catering canisters are utilized in the cargo holds to discreetly load these materials. But the fact that commercial carriers are being used is absolutely beyond dispute. We have the film footage of it occurring. We can ID the aircraft. We have up-close photographs of the nozzles. There's no question. Now, we are communicating with a number of commercial airline pilots. We've had one American Airlines pilot that's retired that spoke out on the record. That's on film at a Northern California governing air quality governing board. That's at geoengineeringwatch.org. It's experts speak out. We have current commercial pilots communicating with us also. They know this is going on, and they are trying to leave, for example, our 20-page fact and photo summary booklets, which I think we talked about that. You have a PDF of that. It's probably our most powerful tool. It's on the homepage of geoengineeringwatch.org. But they're leaving those in pilot lunchrooms and other places covertly. They're afraid of losing their jobs, but they're trying their best to get the word out on this. So again, we don't believe commercial aircraft or personnel are directly involved at all, but I challenge anyone, take a look at the photos we have from multiple commercial carriers with triple nozzle formations aimed right into the exhaust jet stream. Explain that one.
Yeah, so these are civilian aircraft. They should have some say, on the flight line of who has access. If we're all about security, good grief, how many times do we get, scanned, pat down, and everything else with TSA and everything? If they're so concerned about security, there should be somebody on the flight line saying, hey, what are you doing here? What are you putting in my aircraft? It seems to me that we have the means of stopping a lot of this. If we can find out where these planes are taking off from, why can't we just form a barricade, a human barricade, to stop the pilots from going there and say, look, you don't have my consent to spray the sky above my house.
I'm not arguing with that. If what we need the population to understand, this is imperative. We are all passengers on the Titanic right now, and that's a very literal term. And I'll back up to what you just stated in a moment. But mathematically speaking, and I'm not blaming everything on climate engineering, but I'm saying again that it's the single most destructive form of human activity on the planet right now. And that's saying a lot because we have absolutely trashed this planet, again, in the geologic blink of an eye. But mathematically speaking, we're losing 200 to 300 species of plant, animal, and insect a day. I know we're about to a break. I'll finish this quick. That's 15,000 times the normal background rate, 1.5% of normal. On the current course, we are not going to be here much longer. Those in power know that, but they're not willing to let go of their power. They're not willing to let go of climate engineering. We have to bring this to light. We have to stop these programs. That's our first and most important leap forward. So your suggestion of people understanding they're fighting for their life, yes, I agree with you. It needs to reach that point.
Revolutionary Radio Project. I am your host, Rob Skiba. For the second hour of the broadcast, I'm talking with my guest, Dane Wigington. And guys, I can't even begin to stress how critically important this is that you get what's happening here. And Dane, you've mentioned a few times a pamphlet that's on your website. I want to make sure people know where they can go to get that. We have got to take action to try to stop these programs because they're killing literally every living thing on this earth. What's the refer back to your website if you would, and tell people where they can get that flyer that you were talking about.
Our website is geoengineeringwatch.org. It's very important to put the watch at the end of that, Geoengineering Watch. Geoengineering.org is a pro-geoengineering website by the Power Structure Complex. So it's geoengineeringwatch.org. It's on the upper left, our activist materials. And again, we print in massive quantities so that we can pass those materials on at our approximate cost of production and shipping. So we give very big packets at a very reasonable price. We include shipping and tax and everything. And that our only goal is to get those materials out and be able to get as many in circulation as possible. Because as I mentioned to you, I think off the air, we're being heavily censored. We are the largest website in the world on the subject. We are non-political. We don't advertise on the site. We were the top of the first page of a Google search because we had nearly 33 million visitors, we're over 33 million visitors now. So our rankings put it at the top of the first page. About 5 months ago, Google completely deleted us from a search. They do not want people to find a site whose mission it is to expose the climate engineering cover-up. So they deleted us. So we're back to the grassroots efforts are extraordinarily important. We try to provide as many materials as we can. And if I could highlight one thing, Rob, is before I went into break, if I could cover two quick factors, is that okay? I was going into the speed at which the web of life is dying. In regard to insect populations, I think most people intuitively know if the insects die, we will die as well. Almost 10 years ago, Geoengineering Watch was, I believe, the first significant source to state on the record, because of our work with former government scientists, that insect populations were collapsing. And we had noticed in Northern California, we had discovered about an 80% decline in terrestrial insects. The climate and science community rolled their eyes and walked away from that statement and tried to marginalize it. Guess what? We now have peer-reviewed study to prove that we were right. Anyone who searches insect apocalypse will find that peer-reviewed study now proves that insect populations are completely collapsing, aquatic and terrestrial insects. In regard to bees, Rob, you know the bees are dying, I'm sure, right?
I have posted a bunch of stuff out about this. Anytime I see it, I post it on Facebook. I'm like, guys, we lose the bees, we lose everything.
You're exactly right. Now, we tried to communicate with some of the head bee people in the U.S. that there was a much bigger issue than just farm chemicals and radio frequency transmissions, and that issue was toxic heavy metals, as we've discussed throughout this broadcast, that are a primary element named in climate engineering patents. In fact, their stated goal, your listeners can see on film and on the record, if they search Dane Wigington, David Keith, they can see me confronting the world's most recognized geoengineer at an international conference where his proposal was to put 10 to 20 million tons of aluminum nanoparticulates into the sky annually. Now, and I confronted him as to had any toxicological studies been done, and he finally admitted that no, none had. So back to the bees. We now have peer-reviewed study. If your listeners search bees aluminum, they'll find peer-reviewed study to prove that the bees are dying of symptoms that resemble Alzheimer's and dementia in a human being because they are packed full of aluminum. Enough aluminum, it's about 70 times more than would be necessary to cause Alzheimer's or dementia in a human being. Toxic heavy metals are killing the bees 1,000 miles from civilization or wilderness because the saturation of these heavy metals around the planet is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. So the bottom line, again, there's nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Insects are collapsing. Wildlife populations are collapsing. We've lost 60% of Earth's wildlife in the last 40 years. At the current rate of die-off, and I'll leave it with this, at the current rate of wildlife die-off, if that rate does not accelerate, and it is accelerating, I know this is difficult to comprehend, but this is the math of the equation. We face 0 hour for wildlife on Earth by 2026.
2026. Wow.
And consider that we've already lost, in the last 40 years, we've lost 60% of Earth's wildlife populations.
You know, it seems like everybody that I know who has pets, they're dealing with all kinds of skin issues, hot spots. Like, I grew up with dogs my whole life. None of my dogs ever had hot spots. Now it's like everybody I know, their pets have these hot spots and stuff. I mean,
that's true.
It's everything. You see, this is like my thing is like, okay, if we find out, because I got some of those, I've downloaded a few apps where you can flight trackers. You can point up at an airplane and it tells you the tail number and the, you know, if it's American Airlines, United, or whatever. Yeah. And easily 9 times out of 10, when I point at one leaving a trail, nothing shows up. I can point to anything else, and it'll tell me where that plane came from, where it's going, what its tail number is, you know, all of it, what airline. But if I point at one of those, nothing. So those are the ones that I'm like, okay, where are these things taking off from? And if we can figure that out, and we get enough people to wake up, then we just barricade the road. The pilot's got to get to the plane. Well, so let's stop the pilots from getting to the plane.
Peacefully.
Well, yeah, I'm not talking about a violent revolution here, but I am saying, look, I'm not giving you permission to kill me.
It's peaceful civil disobedience, and I cannot deny we must reach that point. And in regard to, again, the dogs or the immune systems or respiratory systems, I'm looking at a new article now. It's about a day old from Vox.com. This is just an example. It's not your imagination. Allergy season gets worse every year. This is part of how official sources cover up the fact that tens of millions of tons of toxic heavy metal and chemical and polymer particles are being dumped into the atmosphere. This is part of how they cover that up. Just tell everybody it's just worse allergies. Now everybody has asthma and COPD and And the public, like frogs in boiling water, have accepted this.
Well, that way they can give you vaccinations.
Well, exactly. And again, the data in that arena that is surfacing is startling. And it is all part of, as you correctly stated earlier in the broadcast, of tightening the noose around our collective necks. Populations are starting to be forced to wake up because conditions are becoming so severe. That's going to increase in the coming weeks and months. We're seeing crop failure all over the globe, and can't hide that much longer. So as we reach that point, as I stated earlier in the broadcast, those in power, the military industrial machine, will likely play some very big cards, will likely drop some very big shoes. So on the radio break, in fact, it referred to what mainstream media is pushing on us, that Iran is a threat to the USA. And that's an absolutely preposterous notion. Let's look at history. In almost 230 years, Iran has invaded no one, no other country. In less than 100 years, the U.S. has destabilized, toppled, and or occupied nearly 100 countries. We have bases completely surrounding Iran. And I saw a well-known journalist who posted a small image with the facetious caption, "How dare Iran put their country so close to our bases?" You understand the point.
Yeah.
And so who's on whose border threatening who? Yeah. And this is where, again, with Iran and the quest for the Earth's remaining natural resources, same with North Korea, which has huge mineral deposits, same with Afghanistan, big mineral deposits, same with Venezuela, world's largest oil deposits. It's about a dying empire, trying to acquire the remaining resources to sustain itself. And this is important as well. Again, as the population begins to wake up to what's going on, to what the military is really about. And again, I know there's good people in the military. I worked as a volunteer rehabbing horribly crippled Vietnam veterans. It broke my heart. I felt deeply for these men, and I respect their motives. But our military now has to wake up to what they're being used for. They're being used for mercenaries for an empire. And this is not to say that Russia or China are benevolent. I'm not saying that. I'm just simply saying that the biggest bully on the block right now, by far, with the military that's bigger than the next 10 militaries combined, is the most desperate and the most dangerous, period. And we need to face that reality. So the bottom line is the U.S. population, as they wake up, is going to be an increasing liability to those in power. And the more disabled, debilitated, and dumbed down that population is, the safer that power structure is. Back to vaccinations, back to the toxic effects of climate engineering, one of the many agendas being carried out. All of it is making us less healthy and less cognitively functional. And that's a mathematical, statistical fact.
I agree completely with what you've said, and it frustrates me. I tell people all the time, look, don't question my patriotism. I love this country, but what this country is doing and doing it through the military, I don't agree with. And my first book was Babylon Rising, and it dealt with a lot of things that was the beginning of my awakening to all this stuff. But this isn't just an American issue. Getting back to this issue of what's happening in our skies, this is worldwide, which means there's got to be some really high level authority that is commissioning people to do this. And it seems like every nation. Are there any countries not spraying?
Yes, one we can say with certainty is Iran.
Oh yeah.
Iran has warned on the floor of the UN that their precipitation was being cut off by NATO weather modification programs. First, Rob, I want to say to you again, you are a patriot, a true patriot, one that has the courage to tell it like it is, that has given 8 years of his life. And I would equate you with a statement from Mr. Twain, Mark Twain, who said this: in the beginning of change, patriot is brave and scarce, hated and scorned. But in the end, when his cause succeeds, the timid join him, for then it costs nothing to be a patriot. And I salute your courage with your military service for the efforts you have made to look through a clear lens, to tell it like it is. And I hope and pray that there are many more in the military like you, because we need them to step forward. We cannot win this battle without our military brothers and sisters waking up. And back to those that aren't spraying, again, Iran is one. And if we look at 9/11, and Rob, you probably saw what Wesley Clark stated 1 week after 9/11. He stated on the record that he was told the countries that were targeted for takedown 1 week after 9/11. Have you ever seen what General Wesley Clark, former NATO Supreme Commander, state that?
Probably. Refresh my memory.
If your listeners look it up, if they look up General Wesley Clark, Middle Eastern countries targeted after post 9/11, they can see on film and on the record, former NATO Supreme Commander Wesley Clark stating he was told 1 week after 9/11, which makes it painfully clear that 9/11 was a false flag event, the new Pearl Harbor that was used. Because again, if you put all this together, everything we've talked about, those in power know that the planet's imploding. They know that. They know that it cannot carry the population much longer. They needed a catalyzing event to galvanize the American population to support what is now a military mercenary force for the empire, to support their quest for resources around the country, to allow or to facilitate the American, or rather for the American population to facilitate or give their support for this military aggression. So 9/11 gave them that. After 9/11, nobody questioned anything. Go get them before they get us. And again, when you have 3,000 architects and engineers, and I'm acquainted with Richard Gage, the head architect for that whole movement, 3,000 plus architects and engineers, top in their field all over the globe, stating on the record the official story for 9/11 is scientifically impossible, then we need to understand that was the new Pearl Harbor, and these countries were named. And now let me back up that. Every one of these countries since 9/11, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, they've all undergone a once in 1,000 year drought. Now, that's not nature. On a warming planet, you must have more rain overall, not less. The atmosphere holds 7% more moisture for every degree C of warming. The only way it can rain less is if someone is interfering in the system, and that's climate engineering. So again, weapon of war. Iran a target as well. Iran has just gone from 1,000-year drought status to epic flood. They flooded almost the entire country. This is weather warfare, plain and simple. And we need to wake populations up and unite them in a common cause to stop this. And back to the countries you mentioned, if I'll finish with this. Just like mafia families cooperate because it's beneficial to each of them in specific ways. Thus, you have countries, China, Russia, the U.S., they are colluding and cooperating on climate engineering for their own purposes, many of which fit into what I've already described, because it helps each of them hang on to their power. So however adversarial they may seem on the surface, they are colluding and cooperating on this issue. And we have Senate documents nearly 800 pages long, going back decades, that state on the document, it's posted at geoengineeringwatch.org with some of the most important parts highlighted, that normally adversarial countries like China, Russia, US, will cooperate on this issue, climate engineering, because of the cross-border ramifications. You can't just geoengineer over your own country without affecting the whole world. They are all working together on this issue.
Well, yeah, it seems to me that they've created this issue by saying, hey, look, this is a worldwide issue that this climate change is happening. So the whole world, everybody needs to band together to stop this. So get in your planes. This is what you need to spray. You know, it must be something along those lines. And people, but they don't question anything. Like most people are like, oh, okay. You know, they just, whatever they say, oh, the scientist said, some white robed priest said that this is the way it is. So let's get in a plane and spray toxic metals over our country. You know, we've got to be able to reach these people somehow, because you have these Luciferian psychopaths at the top causing this stuff, but ultimately it's really Joe Blow wearing a uniform, you know, just doing what he's told, ultimately that's carrying the stuff out.
You're exactly right. You're exactly on target.
But they're reachable. I mean,
yes,
we got it's the they live scenario. We got to have a 15-minute fist fight to get them to put the glasses on. But they are. reach.
I lost your audio in and out there for a second, but I caught enough. Hopefully I can hear you, but I have a clear image of that 15-minute fist fight on that movie. And you're exactly right. And that's what it comes down to. And we need to consider this, that as the proverb goes, we have seen the enemy and they are us. Those in power could not do what they do, as you so correctly just stated, without the full support and cooperation of the majority of the population. And that has to change. And back to, because I'm asked this question all the time, tell us what to do, tell us how to fix this. There's no silver bullet. There's no easy way forward. The only way forward, the only way, is a critical mass of awareness in the population so that they know, our military brothers and sisters especially know, that what they are participating in is the facilitation of what amounts to planetary omnicide. Everything dies. And when they know that, once we reach that point and they refuse to participate, we have a chance of changing the equation. And as dire as the equation looks, and I want to state this clearly on the record too, we could stop every form of human activity right now, including climate engineering. Does that mean everything will reset? No. As I stated earlier, also based on previous paleo events, the equilibrium period after what we have done to the planet is likely to be many millions of years. Does that mean that we can't salvage some of Earth's life support systems? No, it doesn't mean that. We don't know. Quite simply, we are in completely uncharted territory. Let me put this in perspective. I described this mass extinction 55 million years ago, the Pedum event. Now, the changes that are occurring, mathematically speaking, today are happening conservatively 170 times faster than that event. What's happening now is at unimaginably blinding speed. So we truly don't know where we go from here. But this is certain. If we do not stop the single biggest interfering factor with Earth's life support systems, and if we don't allow those systems to respond on their own to the damage done, and there will be horrific blowback. If we stop climate engineering tomorrow, that doesn't mean our climate catastrophes are over. There's an immense amount of pressure built up in the system from the interference for 7 decades. There will be horrific climate backlash, but it has to be allowed to happen. The planet has to be allowed to find a new equilibrium, or mathematically speaking, we're not going to be here much longer.
Man. I mean, it's a lot to take in. It's a lot to, we're going to get ready to go to break in about 5 minutes. I'm pretty much going to turn the last segment over to you and let you go wherever you want to go with it. But, I think, I mean, is it too late because I've been saying it all along. I didn't think it was as dire as you've been expressing. I mean, I knew we're headed for problems, but people ask me all the time, well, what are we supposed to do about it? I mean, you tell me this stuff, what am I supposed to do about it? And I've said, well, step one is we got to get 300 million people in this country to freaking wake up. There's one or two voices crying in the wilderness. They're the crazy people to get locked up. Nobody listens to them. Conspiracy theorists, whatever. But if everybody wakes up, and I say the same thing you say, don't believe a thing I say. Everything I'm saying, look it up for yourself. Because otherwise it's just my opinion. You can think I'm crazy, whatever. But if you look it up for yourself, then you're the crazy one. Because you're going to find the same information. And I mean, it really does go back to 9/11 for many of us. I was on a plane to Kazakhstan, 14-hour flight in 2006, and I'm listening to a couple of people sitting behind me. The entire flight, 14 hours, entire flight, these people were talking about how 9/11 was an inside job. Now, at that time, I was still sucking on the blue pill and didn't believe that. I stood, how dare you? I wanted to strangle these people. How dare you? Because when 9/11 happened, I almost re-enlisted. I was out of the military at the time, but, the attitude among many people, thanks to George W., was, hey, let's turn the entire Middle East into a glass factory. How dare you? So I was going to go back in. So I'm listening to these two yahoos talking about how it was an inside job for 14 hours, and I'm fuming mad. I got home from that trip determined to prove those guys wrong, even though I'd never seen them, and stumbled across the film Loose Change. And, of course, that led down a very deep rabbit hole after that. And, once you start looking at it, it's amazing that anybody believes the official story Especially since the vast majority of the proof that for the official story was a couple of paper passports from the, not just any paper passports, but the freaking passports of the so-called hijackers, just so happened to survive the fireball that melted steel and brought down 3 buildings in New York City at free fall speed from 2 planes. So that was the big wake-up call for me. Was like, okay, I don't live in Leave It to Beaverville anymore. This Pollyanna view that I had of this country is sadly wrong, and we need to wake up, because if they're capable of that level of atrocity, how much more are they capable of? And I think what we're talking about here this evening is a little hint how much more they're willing to do. And I guess we got 2 minutes left. I mean, do you think that? I mean, are we past the point of no return? I mean, I understand it's going to take time to recover from what the damages that has already been done, but I mean, is there any hope here? I mean, what's your take on that?
When I know that there's people like you in the world who are in the military, but yet who are so willing to face reality once you knew what it was, I have hope. I do have hope. And I hope and pray that there are more in the military like you, Rob. And I know there are, but I mean, you are the example of exactly what we need. Someone who is willing to wipe the lens clean and look through a clear lens to see what's really there. So again, not to patronize you, but I mean that most sincerely. If there's more people in the military like you, yes, we have hope of salvaging something. The reality we've known is done. It's not coming back in any time frame that matters. But what is still in our control completely is to use our will correctly. The only thing that we own, the only thing that you or I can truly call our own, is our will and the correct use of that will, and to do the right thing because it's the right thing to do. And an example I've used before, because it's clear, if someone's child was in a burning house, your child, my child, and we knew we had very little chance of running into that house and saving that child, would we not try? We would try. Absolutely would try. And that's what we face now. And if we can provide a pathway for anybody to make it through this, any percentage of the population, we owe that to the whole. And especially those of us with children. We don't own our lives anymore. We owe our lives to those children and to all the children of the world. We owe them our lives. And we're not behaving like very loving parents as a whole. I mean, how many people do I know, as you just correctly described, that go about their life and their personal pursuits of pleasure while the house is literally burning down around us, ensuring that our children have virtually no future whatsoever. So the cold, harsh answer to your question is no, we will never know the planet we have known. We are past the point of any return to what we've known. We've crashed through the guardrail. As a population, as a species, we are hurtling through the air in a car that is, as I said, crashed through the guardrail. We're hurtling to the bottom of the canyon, and the passengers are arguing over what station they put the radio on. That's literally the example of where we're at. But again, we're in uncharted territory. If we can expose and halt climate engineering, that's the single greatest leap we can take in the right direction. If we can do that, we can buy time.
We're back on the Revolutionary Radio Project. I'm your host, Rob Skiba, and for the final half-hour segment of the broadcast, I'm talking with my guest, Dane Wigington. And, I mean, look, I've been on the public scene for almost a decade now doing radio shows, and I have to say, this feels like one of the most important interviews I've ever done. And I'm not just blowing smoke here. I mean, we're talking about something that literally affects all life on this earth. And if what my guest has been talking about for the last hour and a half or so is true, and I'm inclined to believe it is, then we're already past the point of no return, guys. I mean, significant damage has already been done. And we have to run into this burning house and rescue this dying world before we literally cause 0 hour our own apathy. So With that in mind, we got about 25 minutes left. I'm going to turn it over to you to whatever else you want to say. We can breathe a little bit into this process.
Well, I will certainly try to do that. And again, knowing there's people like you out there, and there are others, I've encountered extraordinary people on this journey. It's been 15 years of slogging through this trench for me. And when I began, I could only hear my own voice coming back at me. But now, thanks to people like yourself, we are much more effectively sounding the alarm. And I don't ask anyone, I want to stress this, I'm not asking anyone to believe anything I say. I'm asking them to do honest, objective investigation. And they will be shocked at what they find, just like you were shocked at what you found about 9/11, but you had the courage to look. Another example I used often, it's clear. If you're standing in the freeway, are you better off turning your back to traffic or facing it? And I think that answer is clear. And the wake up is beginning to occur. In fact, as I speak to you, I just received a message. I just received an invite to present data to a meeting in Indonesia with many leaders, including the King of Indonesia. It's just hit my desk now. The wake up is, while we were on this program, in fact, the wake up is occurring exponentially, again, thanks to people like yourself. What can we do along the way? What do we do? How do we do it? First, we need to stay as healthy and cognitively functional as we can in this journey. Although these particulates are easily absorbed by our bodies and very difficult to get rid of, there's much you can do with chelation therapy, heavy metal chelation. Anyone can go to their own nutritionalist, their own health food store. There are very beneficial supplements, even as simple as a good vitamin C, calcium, chlorella, cilantro. There are ways, and again, I encourage people just to find a nutritionalist you trust, have them put you on a very well-designed chelation therapy, if I should say that. It has to be done carefully and cautiously, but it can be done. And that keeps these metals moving through your system. It keeps them from building up. It will keep us more healthy as we wage this war against the collective insanity. Now, about awakening others, I want to put this mathematical equation on the table because it can seem overwhelming. It can seem like an unclimbable summit, but it's not. And if we use this mathematical equation, well, first, sharing credible data, especially with visuals, is exponentially more effective than running out in the street, pointing at the sky and going into a diatribe. That tends to shut people down. But if you share credible data and simply say, hey, this issue is real, research it, the ramifications are grave beyond belief, that's much more effective. That's why we're relying on these materials. Again, we have single-page flyers, we have 20-page booklets, we make large quantities available, our approximate cost of producing and shipping. Or you can print articles offline. You can share from your own home computer for free. We have links on our site. You can share links like you have that are on our home page. It doesn't cost anything. Find groups, organizations, and individuals that would care if they only knew. Because as you correctly stated, reaching a critical mass is the only way forward. And as some tried to show their patriotism, as you expressed yours, you may know of, Rob, the story of Pat Tillman. I'm not sure how many of your listeners know who he is, but he was the multi-million-dollar contract football player that joined the Green Berets after 9/11. And he saw what was happening in our military, and he saw what a circus of criminality it was. And he was going to come back to the U.S. and tell his story, and they killed him. Our own military killed him. 3 rounds in the head with a .223 M16 round from close range. They tried to blame it on an enemy ambush, a complete fallacy. And that's what our military is doing now. That's what the higher ups in our military are doing to true patriots like Pat Tillman. So it's up to us. We are the ones we've been waiting for, as the Hopi prophecy states. It's up to us. Stay healthy along the way. Arm yourself with credible data from a credible source. Geoengineeringwatch.org is independent from all of their sites and sources because we, in regard to this subject and this issue, because we make a very concerted effort to stand on credible, verifiable data, period. And that's imperative. We're weathering an unimaginable storm. We have to have a watertight boat. Does that make sense, Rob?
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, and I can't stress what you were saying enough myself about the staying healthy. Like I said, I thought I was going to die, man. I was so sick for 2 months, like uncontrollable coughing. Like it just, you couldn't clear it, it was just sitting there in my throat. And actually, it worked for me. I was, what do you call it? Vaporizing colloidal silver. That's what actually cleared it up for me, because nothing else was working for me. So find whatever works and start doing it. I did want to ask you before I forget, and it may be a whole show in and of itself, but are you, I'm sure you probably are, familiar with Morgellons, and what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I'll answer the Morgellons question. Let me back up to what you said first, and the remedy you found. That seems very plausible to me, and being proactive was a smart move on your part. And in addition to these particulates being hugely inflammatory to the entire respiratory system, we have, when you saturate the atmosphere with these ultrafine particulates, that's a platform for fungal proliferation to occur. And thus we have epidemics of upper and lower respiratory tract chronic infection. And we have mainstream medicine prescribing antibiotics for this when 90 to 95% of those infections are fungal.
Yeah.
And that's why what you did worked. Fungal infections are very difficult to get rid of. And when you prescribe antibiotics, as most of the Western medical practitioners are doing, that makes it worse, not better, because it kills your beneficial flora, your beneficial microbes. They're treating it in exactly the wrong way. So on geoengineeringwatch.org, there's a post I did called Staying Healthy in a World That Isn't. You can find it under the health section for your listeners. But much like what you described, what you did, which I would argue helped to subdue the fungal infection, there are various nasal spray mixes with materials, not pharmaceutical materials, which have huge side effects, but I prescribe a nasal mix there using tea tree oil, eucalyptus oil, and grapefruit seed extract, and neti pot salt mix or Himalayan salt. You can make your own nasal spray mix for literally about 25 cents per 2-ounce bottle, and that will do profound good. You have to keep the fungal infections down. They tend to keep reoccurring. You have to alkaline your system to create an environment that's not conducive for funguses. It's affecting the environment in the same way, Rob. We have sudden oak death. It's a fungal ailment with the oak trees. We have these particulates, again, are highly toxic. They're killing soil microbes, and that allows fungal proliferation in the environment. And thus, we have fungal infection across the entire web of life at this point. And this is back where climate engineering is the single biggest wrench that's been thrown into the entire web of life by far. On Morgellons, we know polymer fibers are a part of the mix. They're a part of the patents. We've seen what appear to be mechanism malfunctions where the whole landscape is covered with what appears to be spider webs. Have you seen any of those events?
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
Well, unless spiders are building webs out of aluminum and barium, those aren't spider webs. We've tested some of that material, and it appears to, in those cases, possibly have biologicals on it as well. So if the body's ingesting, for example, fibers, you're inhaling those fibers, the body also will try to expel that material, and that may be one of the core factors with Morgellons. So we have, again, we're entering uncharted territory. We have formerly unknown factors and currently unrecognized factors in regard to the mainstream medical community. They're not recognizing these factors, so they won't diagnose things like Morgellons, but certainly it's occurring. And, back to, again, the critical mass of awareness, as you stated, which is absolutely imperative. I would argue it is the only way forward. And with the censorship that's going on with social media, it's up to us to help propagate. If your listeners want to find more videos on this issue, the Dane Wigington YouTube channel, if they just search that, we have a lot more presentations at at geoengineeringwatch.org if they want our updates. We don't send out a lot of material, but we send out what's important, 1 or 2 a week at most. They can certainly subscribe there as well. Again, we're non-political. The entire political system, and they are doing their best, Rob, as I'm sure you've seen, the whole political theater that we see right now is polarizing the population and keeping their eye off the horizon, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So I would encourage people, again, to get past that. I don't care what political stripe it is. I don't care who the occupant of the White House is. They are all part of the power structure. They are all just puppets in the play. It's all mass distraction to keep the population oblivious to what's unfolding until the last possible moment. So sharing credible data from a credible source, imperative, and pay attention to your senses too, Rob. And for your listeners, Rob, have you felt the intensity of the sun on your skin of late?
I have. Like, I like to go out in the afternoon, like around 6 o'clock, as the sun's, it's not so hot. There's a neighborhood pool. That's where I like to go out and do reading. And I've noticed 2 things. It does feel like a different type of heat. And it also appears to me that my surroundings have shifted into the blue spectrum. It seems like, I'm used to the days where a hot sunny day had more of a orange red hue to it, but it seems to me everything is more blue shifted.
A number of factors there. You have light scattering particulates in the atmosphere. That's a factor. But we also have, now we've talked about many of the existential aspects, existential threats relating to climate engineering. It's, again, disruption of the hydrological cycle, intoxication of the entire planet. Back to the ozone situation, which I touched on earlier. Let me put that into perspective. We have right now UVC radiation reaching the surface of the planet. So for your listeners, we are told we have UVA. We're told 95% of incoming UV is UVA. We're told 5% is UVB. That's a lie. We're metering it. We have we've had a former contract engineer from NASA working with us with equipment we supplied to meter this very expensive equipment. So we know now that they are not even measuring for most of the UVB spectrum. How do you report a reading on something that you're not even measuring? So they're only reading a part of the UVB spectrum. They're not reading anything in the UVC spectrum. UVC is the last spectrum of UV radiation before X-ray. We all know how short a time we would be here if we have X-ray on the surface of the planet. UVC is a DNA damaging band of radiation. It's on the surface now. It's killing everything from plankton, microbes, insect populations. If your listeners, when they feel how hot the sun feels, how hot a surface feels, on a car surface, or they see the bark being burned off of trees, that is not normal. It's not natural. It is very dangerous. It is not being reported. So let's just take the UV situation alone and the collapsing ozone layer. And I'm not saying that CFCs, which we're told is the source of the ozone problem, I'm not saying that's not a part of the problem, but it's a very small part of the problem compared to climate engineering. Climate engineering, the single greatest ozone destroying factor of all. At the current rate of ozone destruction, if we had no other problems, if everything else was fine, if the current rate of destruction, if climate engineering continues, they continue to ramp it up and the current rate of destruction continues, mathematically speaking, we're looking at total ozone layer collapse about 2025 or 2026. If that was the only problem we had, that problem alone would mean game over that soon. The ozone layer is disintegrating. Climate engineering and the kind of thinking I described earlier in this broadcast for the military-industrial complex, the more their operations destroy the ozone layer, the more they feel they have a reason to ramp up their operations to even higher levels to try to mask the damage that their programs did in the first place. Mm-hmm. Is that not the definition of insanity?
It is. Man, I mean, do you think, and there's so much to talk about, I feel like we should do another show. The flashpoint of aluminum, with all these microscopic particles descending like hail on us, do you think that that's the reason why we're having such intense wildfires out in your neck of the woods, out there in California and other places, why these fires are so intense?
Thank you so much for addressing that issue. In regard to the epic wildfire scenario, and again, this is not to deny anthropogenic damage to the planet at all. I lectured on global warming before I focused everything on this issue because it was a superseding issue. In regard to the epic wildfires, the single greatest causal factor by far is climate engineering. The factor you just brought up is one part of the equation. So let's look at this in the case of the U.S. West. We can see with NASA satellite imagery, much of these images are posted at geoengineeringwatch.org, that there is blanket grid pattern spraying off the coast constantly. The climate engineers control the flow of moisture. They control the spigot, period. They can dry it out. They can deluge it. It's a haphazard control. I'm not saying it's an exact scenario, but they are still largely in control of the spigot. So they can and have cut off the moisture. What they're doing now in regard to the fires, again, so they can drought an area out. Sometimes those areas might be considered climate sacrifice zones. We have the trees dying from the ground up below the soil from the toxic metals in the rain, which I mentioned. We have incredibly intense UV radiation frying the trees from the top down. It's so hot that the trees shut their stomata, they shut their respiratory ports, they stop breathing. That's why the forests don't smell like forest anymore, because the trees are literally in what should be considered almost a comatose state. And as you correctly stated, you have incendiary metals covering everything, the foliage, everything. These metals also make the atmosphere more electrically conductive. So you have a dried out atmosphere, more dry lightning, incendiary dust, and you have forests that go up like they're soaked in napalm. Now, why would they allow this to happen? And they are not only allowing it to happen, they're facilitating it. I challenge people, one of the most important videos we ever did is addressing the fire scenario. And they should go to Geoengineering Watch and search engineering wildfires. It appears, I told you we may have an ice-free Arctic this year. If that happens, our world will change at that moment. The heating goes so unimaginably exponential because we lose the ice, we lose the reflectivity, just like the ice in your glass, Rob. Your glass stays very cold until that last ice cube's gone. Heating goes exponential. That energy transfer is done. Heating goes exponential. Now we have that on steroids on the planet. It appears, and we have data to support this in our video, that the climate engineers are so desperate to stay off cataclysm for even one more season that they are facilitating the incineration of forests in order to burn as hot as possible, to loft those smoke particulates as high into the atmosphere as possible, which keeps them aloft, it keeps them in the air longer. And the farther north those fires are, the more quickly, because of the Coriolis effect of the planet, the spinning of the planet, the more quickly they spin to the polar regions. They spin over the North Pole for the northern latitude fires, South Pole for southern latitude, and that provides temporary cooling for the Arctic at the cost of ensuring we have no chance for the long run. Now, I understand how dire that statement is, but I want your listeners to understand that we have science study that states in the eyes of the power structure, the beneficial effect of northern latitude forest fires for temporary cooling the Arctic. Think how insane that is. To mask this situation even one or two more seasons, they're willing to incinerate the last of Earth's life support systems. And what do we see right now? We have a flow of moisture into California, cooling the U.S., as I stated earlier. But what do we see further north of us? In Siberia, epic wildfires in regions that should be frozen till June. Massive wildfires in Canada, Alberta right now. I don't know if you know that was going on. Did you know that there was an absolute state of emergency in Canada?
No, I had no idea.
Going on right now. We see nothing about it. Epic wildfires, dozens of them. Right now, northern latitudes doing exactly what they did last year. Sweden, Finland, Norway, Canada, Alaska, BC. This is absolutely, we can speculate on the agendas. We can speculate on that. But what we can say for certain is that climate engineering is the single greatest core causal factor for the wildfires. And one last point before I give this back to you. I know we're almost out of time. Encourage your listeners to also search at the homepage of geoengineeringwatch.org on the top toolbar, Engineering Winter, because as I stated again, they can also, with chemical ice nucleation materials, they can cause weather whiplash cool downs that are unimaginably profound, 60, 70 degrees in a day, cold, dense layer of air in the ground that may be only a few hundred feet deep, but it creates the illusion of cold on a planet that's in total meltdown. I encourage your listeners to search engineering wildfires and engineering winter and go through those whole sections. They will not like what they find.
I was in Alberta, I think it was last August, and they were having wildfires up there. Have they just continued? Are new fires? Are they, or has it been burning since August?
No, you had a cessation in the quote winter, but it's full-blown incineration right now. And how many Americans have any idea? And what do we see in the southern hemisphere over their summer to keep Antarctica from completely blowing apart? We saw massive epic wildfires at the southern tip of South America, Tasmania, southern Australia. Record wildfires, evacuations. In Tasmania has historically never burnt. The bottom line is they are incinerating forests, it appears, as a last-ditch desperate measure to get enough atmospheric particulate loading, which blocks the sun temporarily. And I encourage your listeners, again, search the video we did. It has profoundly inarguable data, satellite imagery of the smoke plumes, where they went, the cooling it caused, science study that states specifically, in the eyes of the climate engineers, the desirable effect for this scenario. I'm saying it's that desperate. We are a minute before midnight right now. Our reality is going to change soon. What will we do in the time we have to take a leap in the right direction?
So most of what you're saying, though, I am not on board with the war mentality, but however,
what mentality? I couldn't hear you.
Al Gore.
Yeah, nor am I.
On that said, I do believe we need to get off of so-called fossil fuels, and we need to. I believe that there's technology that has been around for decades that could have had us off of that a long time ago. But it does appear. That is causing problems. Certainly, I don't discount that, but it seems to me it's the sun itself that is heating up more.
Actually, I know there's data that would try to make us believe that, but that data is not coming from any recognized science source. And in fact, what we see right now, the Earth is in the elliptical phase of its orbit. It should be and would have been cooling. That changed at the Industrial Revolution. So again, what we see right now, regardless of any cosmological factors, the anthropogenic effect, everything we've done to the planet, we've been horrible stewards of the planet. Again, I don't like Al Gore. Carbon credits are a sham, but the fact is this: it's not as bad as Gore stated. It's exponentially worse. It's unimaginably worse. And climate engineering is a key part of that worst scenario. So again, Rob, as an example, to state that this is in any way a natural scenario would be like running someone over in a crosswalk with a semi and trying to make the argument that they died of a heart attack. This is a result of human activity, with climate engineering at the top of the list. And as far as the environmental groups, let me state this: they are not addressing this issue because they're afraid of losing their 501c3 nonprofits. Same with the spiritual organizations. We have pastors hiding behind pulpits, not addressing this issue. And biblical scripture does not allow that kind of behavior. We're required to be good stewards of the planet. Same with all the major traditions. So the bottom line is we're in a fight for life. And if we reach a critical mass of people who realize that and who behave accordingly, if we stand together, we may yet take a quantum leap in the right direction. And that's worth trying.
Well, we got about 30 seconds left. Thank you so much for coming on, Dane. I would probably like to have you on again if your schedule allows. There's a lot more to talk about, but I do also, I come from a biblical worldview, so I'm thinking there's a lot of things that we need to do physically, spiritually. We need to be proactive in all of it right now because time is short no matter how you look at it.
And Scripture requires that.
Absolutely.
Scripture requires we stay at our post until we're relieved, period, and to be good stewards.
That's right. Well, thanks so much, Dane. Thank you guys for listening to the Revolutionary Radio Project. We'll see you back next Wednesday, 11 p.m. Central Standard Time. Good night, everybody.